Hi, and welcome to the Lived Experience Summit. I'm Nicole, founder and chief courage officer at Neon Shed, and today I am talking to two amazing women. We have Evelyn Field, who's a psychologist, author, speaker, and chair of the Australian Association for Workplace Bullying Professionals, and she was also awarded an Order of Australia Medal for her initiatives for school and workplace bullying. We also have Dr. Pat Ferris, all the way from Canada, and she's a psychologist, therapist, and trains all over the world, and has also written some pretty significant papers. And you've written one together, and we're going to chat about that shortly. But thank you both for coming and for being a part of this summit. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Good day down there.
What are some of the key themes that you're seeing in your psychology practices? Pat, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. You know, my practice ranges, as you said, from doing interventions with organization training, and I do a lot of clinical work with targets. And you know, I'm just going to share my screen because I think in pictures, and I put a great big picture here of kind of what I've been seeing, and I'm calling it the toilet bowl cycle. And one of the things I want people to look at is, you know, what is it and how do we fix it? So one of the things that I'm seeing over the last several years is a greater awareness on the individual level of what workplace bullying is, how it affects people, and a real much over the last few years, a big movement towards an expectation of justice in dealing with workplace bullying. So it's no longer okay for workplaces to ignore. And when they do, and there's big cases or small ones, it hits social media. So more and more people are aware of what's happening and expecting their organization to deal with justice by following policies, by providing support. And of course, the organization's job in doing that to not go into the toilet bowl cycle is to have a culture of justice, one where people feel they belong, where there's compassion for one another, and where there's training for everybody, including bystanders. When that doesn't happen, what I'm seeing is a lot of wiggling out. And I think that's what's hitting social media a lot these days, is what we call institutional betrayal, and how organizations, I'm shocked how many organizations try and wiggle out of responsibility by stonewalling, criticizing, gaslighting, doing the DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim offender process. So that's probably always been happening, but it's way more visible. And that's leading kind of naturally to people feeling outraged, especially those who are wired strongly for justice will feel a strong moral outrage. And of course, that's a natural reaction. But when the organization continues to wiggle out and wiggle out, we get more and more outrage to the point often that it hurts the person. It becomes very damaging to the person who's engaged in that. And so it's really at that point that, you know, to get out of that cycle, not to stop looking for justice, but to get out of a harm to yourself cycle, that people need counseling, coaching, and consultation. And that's what Evelyn and I are going to talk a bit more about as we go on. But if moral outrage continues because the organization continues to wiggle out, people start to get pulled into that, and we get what we call generalized negative reciprocity, where everybody's in it, everybody's taking a side, and then around and around we go, and that's what I call the toilet bowl cycle. The way out of that, again, is team debriefings, institutional upstanding, the crew process, which was an old process done in the Veterans Administration, where you just talk about civility and respect in the workplace. And you talk about it a lot, and you have it facilitated, and you make that commitment. So the arrows are the plumbing that, to me, fix the toilet bowl cycle I've just talked about. So this is what I'm seeing playing out in social media, playing out in therapy, playing out in people's lives.
That's such a great way to to showcase it and also showcase the solutions. You can get
Yeah.
out of the toilet. Evelyn, what are you seeing? What are some of the key themes that you're seeing?
Well, I love the analogy. So I'm still stunned thinking of the toilet. But definitely it is a cesspool, the whole area of workplace bullying. I think I'm seeing it from a different perspective, and that is I don't see much change. I think there is greater awareness. I agree with Pat. The trouble with greater awareness and legislation is that people think, as Pat has written, that we've got a policy, it will be respected. And we work at human rights organisations, we work at workers' compensation organisations, we'll be valued, protected, respected. And of course, that's where the greatest letdown occurs. I always say, if you work for the mafia, you know what you're going to get. And some people are lucky they work for nice organisations where they are respected and valued. In fact, I was away recently and met a pilot from Virgin Airlines, and she was tall. She wanted to be a pilot since she was about 6, but her girlfriend worked for Qantas, and she's taking them to court because she's being bullied. But she said she knows Richard, and he was really nice, and you could have a chat to him. Well, nobody could say that about anybody at Qantas. So it's interesting. Some organisations are nice and respect their employees and their public and shareholders, and others don't care. And my feeling is that you can't almost blame them, because some organisations are so badly constructed, so constantly under review and what do you call it, jobs reshuffled around. They're just trying to survive, and people get caught. And then we can add another thing, and that is, why doesn't everyone get injured by it? And that's a big question for me. What do some people do that other people don't do? So I know you can be in the wrong place at the wrong time, a brick falls on your head. True. But of the long-term clients I see, most of them have had vulnerable upbringings, and we could, for want of a better word, we could say somehow the resilience to deal with nasty people is less prominent. And being a psychologist, and because of my background training, I'd say there are attachment issues there. In other words, if you've had a relationship with your mum where she hasn't been able to give you what you need, not that she was a bad mother or not, it's irrelevant, but what you needed. You know, so I can remember when I was very young, asking my mum for something, and she had no interest whatsoever. I aged 2.5. I still remember it right now. And I realized then I'm on my own. Now, fortunately, I was never bullied at work, but I was certainly bullied at school and probably other places too. So I think we have to look at the individual factors. We know the organisational factors, and it is a workplace injury. But some people are more vulnerable. And I think we have to accept that. And I think what that means to me is we've got to educate people, because we've got to educate. This is bullying. This is bad. This is what you can do. If you're a bystander, this is what you can do. If you're human resources, you can do this. Most human resources don't know bullying if they fell over it. So I think that I don't expect organisations to change that much. I do think we can empower people to block bullies when we can. So I've had, if I can keep going, very interesting experience. I wrote my school bullying book in 1999, rewrote it in 2007, and this is the last version coming out in November, Bully Blocking, and it is for children at school. And of course, I've had to do a total rewrite because things have changed a lot. But what have we found? There's been some wonderful school bullying programs around the world. What's the success rate? 4 out of 5 fail. What's the incidence of bullying? According to UNESCO, 1 in 3. 20 years ago, 1 in 5, 1 in 6. So I don't see how organisations can change that much. Maybe I'm a pessimist, but I think we need to empower kids how to deal, and adults, how to deal with bullying, how to recognise it and how to take action. And that in my, I've got a checklist I use for clients, and everybody says the same thing. I wish I would have taken action earlier, whether I would have left, whether I would have confronted or whatever. So I'm hoping we can empower more people to understand what it is and what they can do.
Fantastic. Thank you, Evelyn. And the themes that you both have shared, we could go into detail on each of them for at least an hour for each topic. So, but what I want to touch on now is your paper. So you've co-authored a paper and it's called The Diagnosis and Treatment, Repairing Injuries Caused by Workplace Bullying, which is part of the Handbooks of Workplace Bullying, Emotional Abuse and Harassment book series. Can you share an overview of your findings in there?
Well, I think basically, Pat and I belong to the International Association of Workplace Bullying and Harassment, and we've both been attending to conferences for many years. And at one stage, they had a 2-hour meeting for a therapist group, and that became half day and then a full day. And I chaired that, and Pat was my co-chair. And in it, we had a full day of talking about diagnosis and treatment issues. And I think that, if I'm correct, Pat, lay the foundation for this chapter, where our experience talking to people, therapists, psychologists around the world, about what are the essentials. Now, it hadn't been done before. So I think this is the first paper I know of that says, hey, we've got to diagnose people who are bullied at work. And in fact, my research, and I'm sure Pat's is the same, is that there's a very clear pattern. There's a constellation of symptoms that you know exactly what's gone wrong. For example, the level of rumination. The other thing we said is, well, there's no suggestion about therapy. What therapy can you use? What's evidence-based? Pat uses therapies we wouldn't be allowed to use in Australia. That's the way it is around the world. So we've created guidelines, and I think that's very important. Funny enough, I thought, well, there's one for workplace bullying. What about one for school bullying? And I looked around the world, and my experience was the same. There is nothing or very little for school bullying. There are very few therapists and very few theories. You can count them on your hand almost. So I've done a chapter for counsellors working with kids, and anyone's welcome to read that. I'm sure you'll see a lot of comparison because I based it on this chapter. But this is a really sad situation where if we look for people who are working in the area of workplace bullying as specialists, and we're looking for theories of treatment, it's very hard to find anything apart from this chapter. Am I correct, Pat?
For true. I think there's more evidence coming out of various treatments. But what I would like to comment on is I think the trust in the therapist, or what we call the therapeutic alliance, is so critical here, because the essential wound that's happened to someone is a breach of trust in a place that should be safe. They've been hurt in a place where there's usually legislation, policies. Work shouldn't hurt, work shouldn't injure. So when that happens, and our work tribe, does the worst thing to us that hurts a human more than anything, rejects us, ostracizes us, verbally abuses us, that really does result in, first, the setting off of alarm bells and a stress response that can lead to absolute exhaustion, and studies now show complex PTSD. So we don't want to lose sight of the fact that what are we working with? The wound we're working with is similar to domestic abuse, where someone's been hurt in a safe place, and the belittling and the things that can go on can damage people far worse than we can imagine. And we have struggled to use diagnostic criteria such as complex PTSD because that's not in the DSM-5. It's now in the ICD-11, I think. So we at least have something to go on there. But as Evelyn mentioned earlier, not everyone goes to the severe extreme, although many do, but people will still have quite a big stress reaction. And so, as Evelyn commented earlier, people say, I wish I had come to therapy earlier, or I wish I'd intervened earlier, because when there is that early intervention, even if it's coming to therapy and understanding what's happening to you, no, you're not crazy. This is how human beings react. when this happens to us, then we can get strategies to deal with it. And it becomes the diagnosis that everybody wants to use all the time, which isn't appropriate, but it could be an adjustment disorder at that level. But that is not an appropriate diagnosis for someone who has been chronically traumatized, deeply traumatized over time, may have had some antecedent experiences earlier on that made them more vulnerable. It doesn't matter. They got a severe injury that we need to be able to diagnose with a proper diagnosis, because at that level, adjustment disorder is simply not appropriate and blocks people from getting time off work, from workers' compensation, from all sorts of stuff. So I think that's where our paper goes, is that we need to understand the depth of the harm, and that the first steps are often just building the therapeutic relation, and that takes longer than in many other cases. And then we do some psychoeducation to help people in somewhat almost in a cognitive behavior therapy way reframe what's happened to them. And then we can engage in a treatment. And I do believe that there's many different kinds of treatment that will be appropriate, that you need to fit to your skills and what works for your client. So I don't think there'll ever be a single treatment, but I think there can be the single treatment process.
If I could add to that, when the DSM-5 was being touted and discussed, I wrote to Dr. Matthew Friedman, and he said bullying per se is not mentioned in the DSM-5, but where there is a threat to life, then you could, what do you call it, consider it to be a trauma. In fact, bullying is now mentioned at the back of the DSM-5 for workplace bullying, but not for school bullying. But of course, for this new book, I wrote to him again, and he replied again. So I find that amazing. Anyway, he's back to the same thing, where you feel that your life has been threatened. You're out of a job, you've lost your health, maybe your marriage is affected, your kids don't want to talk to you, whatever. Then you've perhaps experienced a trauma. So after 6 months, we need to look at the concept of trauma. And I think a lot of people, particularly psychologists, psychiatrists, find that extremely hard. They can't understand how being told you're no good and get out of here, humiliation and ostracism, is a threat. But it is a threat to our social brain. It's a threat to our existence. We are social beings. We need to belong to survive. Even a lion needs to belong to a pride to survive. And so when someone says, you're no good, get out of here, it just destroys our brain. And I think that connection is very hard to make. That is, bullying may lead to PTSD or trauma, and what I call a workplace bullying trauma, and it stuffs your life up forever. And I'm in the fortunate position where, like Pat, I see some people for 12, 13, 14 years, and I can see a little bit of improvement, and it's incredibly slow. But just most people don't understand how this abusive treatment of yelling, excluding, ostracizing can damage a person's life forever.
And you have some amazing imagery on how it changes the brain. Did you want to walk us through some of those? I know you both have some, great graphs.
Do you want me to start, Pat, or do you want to go first?
You start with the Lieberman and Eisenman social brain, since that's what you've been talking about. Right. And the pain overlap theory. I think that's okay. Things well.
Can everyone see the screen, or is that? I'll bring it down. Yeah. So Matthew Lieberman and his wife, Naomi Eisenberger, and it's certainly worth watching his social brain talks on YouTube. He talks about the fact that we experience a physical pain and in a certain part of the brain, but if we have a social pain, like humiliation, exclusion, it's experienced in the same part of the brain. And of course, as Panadol works for physical pain, it could perhaps, he says, work for social pain. So that's, as you can see, physical pain, social exclusion being treated unfairly. On the other side, that when we experience a physical pleasure, we experience it social pleasure in the same part of the brain. And that's having, nice coffee for some people, or an ice cream, having a good reputation, being treated fairly, cooperating, giving to charity, and even Schadenfreude. Okay, so let's move that down. And this one is divided into two, but I think it's about thinking about what happens. We realize something's happening, and we think, oh, this is not right. I don't feel comfortable. I'm annoyed. I'm frustrated. I'm scared. I'm vomiting on the way to work, crying in the toilet, whatever. What do I do? And so we have choices. We go into the fight, flight, or freeze mode, which is our basic survival instinct coming from, the back of our brain, our very primitive brain. Instead of saying, oh, this guy's had a hard time, or he doesn't know how to get on with people, or he's this or she's that, how do I deal with them? In other words, how do I deal with the bullying using my prefrontal cortex? In other words, being sensible about it. Unfortunately, what most of us do is we react. We get angry. How dare you say this is no good? I've spent all weekend on this. Why did you ring me 8 o'clock Friday night? We get angry, or we freeze, or we just run away and hide. It'll get better next week. They'll stop. It'll be fine. So we go into this very basic primitive fight, flight, or reflex. And on the right-hand side, which is from Pat, you can see where you have the antecedents, then the bullying. It threatens our basic needs, and we go into our fight, flight, or freeze. We try and cope. But of course, like many things, we will fail because we're not using our resources, and we don't have access to the company's resources. In other words, nobody cares. And so we break down. And the next slide is, to me, a very significant one, because we forget that, like the heart or the stomach, the brain is part of the body. You can't see how many stents I've got in my heart. I know they're there. And it's the same thing if I'm being bullied. It's going to alter my brain. It is PTSD. It is a trauma. So we can look at the left-hand side, the healthy brain and the abused brain. We can look at how depression changes the brain. And down below, and this is from Mutzel, you can look at the bully's brain and the victim's brain. Now, how accurate these all are, I think the jury's still out as far as I'm concerned. But the fact is this: we know that depression looks different on the brain, PTSD, bipolar disorder, etc. And we know from the symptoms that the brain has been changed. And hopefully Pat and her colleagues in the UK will start coming up with brain scans that say this has been caused by bullying, not sexual abuse, not domestic violence, not breaking up with your boyfriend, not losing money in the races, but this has been caused by workplace bullying. And that's where we're going to be headed, I think, in the next 10 years.
Powerful stuff. Thank you, Evelyn.
I think the takeaway message is that bullying is a severe psychosocial stressor. So we know the impact of severe psychosocial stressors on many other mental illnesses, and we can make the leap, the deduction that there will be similar things happen. But there's been recent studies that have shown the same stuff with severe stressors, that the hippocampus where memory is stored shrinks. People aren't able to store memory. The prefrontal cortex doesn't connect as well. People aren't able to regulate emotionally. But there was one interesting study recently by Nolfi et al. That showed that showed some changes in the language area of the brain. And I find that curious, because we don't have language to describe our experiences very well. And many people that I see have real issues with talking about it and describing it to others. So this becomes really interesting for investigators and, to understand that those who are coming to you are going to have difficulty, or probably have difficulty, talking about it, describing it. That's why I like to use some inventories. But I'll also comment at this point that, Evelyn, you talked about the day that we spent going over symptoms, and it was quite a day. I think that was that in Milan, or maybe it was up in Scandinavia. It's 2014, I think. But I still have this in my drawer, and I do want to publish at some point. But it was amazing how many physical symptoms were put up on our charts by the various therapists involved, reporting what their clients report. And that is something that I see, that anybody who's coming to me with more than a mild sort of injury or reaction is going to have a lot of inflammatory responses. They're going to report a lot of physical pain. And quite often, some of the treatment needs to involve going to massage, physio, or something that deals with the physical pain. And that goes, again, speaks to the overlap theory of social pain and physical pain. So as therapists, or as people who've experienced this, we need to connect those kinds of inflammatory diseases. And, you know, it has been shown that bullying is associated with 2 times the incidence of cardiovascular disease, 5 times the incidence of diabetes, like 9 times depression, 20 times suicide, cancers. And I see this, you know, sadly, in my clinical practice, I've watched some of my clients end up with cancers. And so can I prove it causally? No, not at this point, but we sure have strong associations.
The one that I find, apart from rumination, most common is weight gain. Some have weight loss, but the most common, I mean, obviously sleep problems, cognitive problems, social problems, all right across the board. They're all the same. You know, I have a checklist I hand out, and if anyone's interested, very welcome to contact me. But the weight gain is big standout, and then you get diabetes, and then you get sore knees and sore backs and just everything, no energy. Yeah. So I think the issue is that bullying changes the brain and the body and the gut.
Yeah, it does. So what can we do? You have both been therapists for decades, and you've been specializing in this area. So I would love to get some of your practices or the therapies that you do that can help targets repair that harm. So Pat, maybe if we start with you and then jump to Evelyn, that would be great.
Because I have degrees in both organizational psychology and clinical social work, I'm going to talk from both sides. Organizations have to take this seriously. You can have all the policy, all the training you want, but if people aren't prepared to act on it, if they aren't prepared to create a sense of belonging, a sense of compassion, you're not going to get anywhere with anything. And so the only kind of intervention at the organizational level that has really had some statistical significance was the crew interventions at the Veterans Administration in the US. And they hired a facilitator who talked on a weekly basis with groups and teams of people. And it's simple to say and harder to do in these competitive times. Or tribal species, we need to belong. We need to understand how important belonging is. So there's a lot more I could say about what organizations can do, but that's one of my favorite threads. But therapeutically, I would encourage anyone who's experienced incivility, abrasive supervision, any of those terms we use, and are feeling some kind of a stress response, you need to go and have a therapist who understands this area. Because I've had many people come to me and say, you know, my therapist just told me to get back to work, or it wasn't anything, or they started with CBT right away, and I know it's a good therapy, but I couldn't start there. I needed to gain their trust. So I think there is enough evidence of the process of therapy. So, you know, for myself, CBT creeps in at some point, rumination focused behavior therapy. I will use cognitive processing. I've used eye movement desensitization reprocessing. Again, carefully selected and curated for the client that you're dealing with, and the degree of injury and their own antecedents and everything. I use a lot of hypnosis, and that seems to be quite helpful. But the biggest thing is that the therapist is there through whatever is going to go on and help people make decisions about how they use their moral outrage, how they seek justice, so that you don't hurt yourself anymore. What I would say to people is, when you find yourself ruminating, thinking over and over and over without a different idea coming into your head, you're in a serious place and you need to go get that figured out. When you're trying to pull everybody in, and we want to, because of course it's justice, but that will often backfire. You need to start to go and talk about this and think about it and find some support. And I think it starts with understanding that this is serious. When we're rejected, that is one of the most harmful things that a human being can experience. And it triggers the biggest moral outrage and search for justice of anything, and gets us into that toilet bowl cycle. And so how do we use that productively?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Evelyn, how about you?
Right. So I speak to organisations. I'm going up to Sydney next week to speak to some organisation. I hope you've got warm weather. And I think I've had another look. And I think that it's, when you read a recipe, they say, well, take 2 teaspoons of this and 5 of that and that. They don't say, make sure you've got a really clean surface. Don't burn your hands. Use a really good knife. The basics are not there. And I think we've got to get the basics in organisations. So to me, it's about commitment. Do you want a safe, respectful workplace or not? It's about working together at all levels, across all levels, up and down, across way, like Richard does at Virgin Airlines. Compassion. I think we've got to have compassion for people. We're working with people. We don't have to love them, but we have to try and understand them and do our best, because we're all there under the same payroll, and we want to achieve better for the organisation. The fourth one is competence. And I think there are so many managers, so many human resources, so many mediators that lack competence. And I think competence for employees means you've got to know what bullying is and take some responsibility for your behaviours, either as a bully, a bystander, or as a target. And finally, I think there needs to be some consequences. You can't get away with this behaviour all the time. Now, in my therapy, and I only see bullied clients, I don't do anything else. I stick with the 3 processes that Pat and I wrote about. That is psychoeducation and process therapy, that relationship. And I think those are the 2 most important things. And then in terms of actual, what we call goal-based therapy, I use a bit of CBT. I use a lot of Ericksonian questioning. I don't use hypnotherapy. In Australia, it's a bit dodgy now. But, Ericksonian hypnotherapy you can use without putting people to sleep. A lot of questioning. If there's medico-legal stuff going on, that's entirely different. And I say to people, you've got a choice here. Well, many have a choice. Some people don't. But I say, this is your journey. You choose where you're going on the train. I will support you, knowing that any medico-legal action, IMEs, independent medical examiners, is going to be extremely difficult. But then what I do is I go through my checklist. What's your sleep like? What's your diet like? What sort of exercise are you doing? And a lot of people give up. And this is where I'm pushing on a very regular level. You've got to exercise to reduce the anger, the anxiety, the depression, etc. And that's a very slow process, but very important. And the number 4 is the zone out, the meditation, the mindfulness, the being in the here and now. Now, all of those are really hard for traumatized people. I've got a trauma from the past. I'm not going to do meditation. It just doesn't suit me. But working in the garden, listening to Netflix, listening to music, cooking, spending time, if I can, with friends or the dog, the cat, I've got clients whose lizards are very empathic. Maybe it's a soft toy, but it's about being able to put the whole world out and just zone in on here and now. And I think that's really important, because they're going to ruminate. They're going to do all those other sorts of things, medico-legal papers, etc. So it's pushing them all the time to be in the here and now, and, you know, spend an hour if you want on the past, and let's plan the future, moving between the past, the present, and the future. But most important, I think, with trauma is just to be in the here and now.
Oh, well said, Evelyn. Yeah, totally agree. And I think the all the exercises and the mindfulness part of calming the nervous system, you know, being polyvagal informed is really important, because people who've been exposed to a chronic stress like bullying's nervous system is up here, and it's not coming down unless you work at it. Yeah.
If I see somebody who's just in the process of being bullied, I don't know what Pat would say, but I find it really easy, because they are fighting back. They're giving their power to the bully. So what I do is I teach them my bully blocking strategies, which are extremely simple. The problem is, by the time people come to me, it's too late for that. So you might say, well, what are my bully blocking strategies in 5 seconds?
Yep.
I'll try and do it very, very quickly. But basically, you know, if you meet a strange dog in the street, you don't go up and pat, because you don't know if the dog will bark, bite, or whatever, run off. So you check the dog out to see if this dog is peaceful, if it's okay, what does the owner say, is there hair up on the back of their head, etc. You check them out. And it's the same thing. And then you take action. You might pat them or just walk off. But certainly with any animal, the moment you show your fear or anger, you threaten them. You know, if you saw a bear in the wild, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, you stand still and make a noise. You don't run. Now, this doesn't apply to kangaroos or saltwater crocodiles, but most other animals, right. You just stand still, you're calm, maybe you back away calmly, maybe you make a noise for the bear, but you don't run. It's the same thing with a bully. You don't show your fear. You don't get angry. You don't stay paralyzed. You have to put on a square smile. You have to be very pleasant, stand very upright. Oh, thank you for telling me. That's very interesting. Or I'll Google that tonight. In other words, find ways in which you block the bully. You don't fight back using your anger, your fear, your whatever. You're just neutral. And we all know what it's like to be stonewalled by somebody. It's about doing it in a similar way. It's a bit like grey rock. Speak to the hand. I'm not sorry. Speak to the hand. I'm not listening. So the bully blocking strategies are very easy to learn.
Oh, love it. And really appreciate that too, because people might be wondering, oh gosh, what can I do? And that's really what this entire summit is about. And to have you both here sharing your insights, your wisdom, your history, your experience is so valuable. And I really appreciate it. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being involved in this. I really appreciate it, and know everyone will get a lot of value out of it.
Oh, been a pleasure. Love to talk about it, and love to talk with Evelyn. And thank you, Nicole, for all that you're doing in this area.
You're welcome. I think together we can make real change, and we are. So yeah, let's just keep going, and we'll get this message out to as many people as possible.
I think awareness raising and education is the way to go, and you give people options. You know, it's the same thing as we've had with COVID. Once we realized that it was life-threatening, we had to change our behaviors and take responsibility for ourselves. And I think we need to do the same thing with bullying. We can't expect big organizations to change like that. You know, we have to take responsibility. It's our life, and we have to look after ourselves, and the resources are there for individuals. But just don't let it get too late, because then it's just awful how people's lives are just devastated.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's help stop that. And this information has been amazing in the steps towards that, and what you're doing with your clients is so wonderful and supportive. You're probably the same as me, though. My goal is to put myself out of a job. If I didn't have to do what I'm doing, then that would be wonderful. But yeah, while we need to, let's keep doing it and keep making and being the change that we want to see. So thank you again, both of you. Really appreciate it.
Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.